Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the globe joining us today. This is Bridget from Acquia. Today's webinar is Planning for the Personalization Journey from Empathy to Engagement with Dave Sawyer and Kasia Sinczak from FFW and Eric Fullerton from Acquia. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please send them in the Q&A tab and I will assist you. If you have any questions for the presenters, please submit them in the Q&A tab as well, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Slides and the recording of this webinar will be posted to acquia.com and also sent to you via email within the next few days. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Dave.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and thank you everybody for joining today to our session, Planning for the Personalization Journey from Empathy to Engagement. Before we jump into the session, we'd like to just tell you a little bit about FFW, where myself and Kasia work. FFW provides great experiences on both sides of the screen. We're a global digital agency providing a range of strategy, UX, design, and development services. We've got 250 plus Drupal specialists and 120 Acquia certified developers on staff. And we're one of Acquia's leading partners, and we're very happy to be here today. My role at FFW is the lead of the Insights and Optimization team, which is the team that oversees analytics, personalization, and other data-driven services. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kasia Sinczak. Kasia?
Hello, everyone. I'm a lead content strategist and user researcher at FFW. So I work with Dave and other folks on the technical and user experience side to make sure that we're delivering the best content that we can for our clients' users.
Great. We're also joined with Eric Fullerton from Acquia.
Yes, Eric Fullerton, product marketing with Acquia for our personalization and journey orchestration products, and you'll be hearing from me a little bit later.
Great. We'll jump into the presentation today. Kasia, would you like to go over what we'll be covering?
Yeah, thank you. So the goal of the presentation today is to talk to you a little bit about personalization and how to make it better. We'll kick off with describing what personalization is. We'll talk about how we get towards a better model of personalization, going through a couple of key issues that companies usually run into based on our experiences. And we'll help you kick off your personalization endeavors by talking about things like pilots and where to get started. We'll have Eric talk a little bit about what Acquia does from a platform perspective to support personalization. And at the very end of the session, we'll leave some time for questions. So as we're going through, if anything comes up, write it down and be sure to ping us at the end. So before we have, let's talk about the what. So at a high level, as a company, what do you want out of personalization? As we've gone through this with our clients, we see this as a two-piece goal. There's the business and what you're going to put in front of a user and what the user is going to do. So the ultimate goal of personalization is to give a user something that will cause some sort of desired effect. There's, essentially a theme of alignment here of, what are you doing as a business and what are you putting in front of a user and when are you doing that such that your user is responding to you. For folks with a psychology background, this is very much experiment design. It's along the same lines of paradigm. So thinking about this from an alignment perspective, at its core, personalization is finding the right person from the sum of everyone who could be interacting with your experiences, figuring out who that person is, putting the right stuff in front of them, and we'll talk about how to get to the right stuff a little bit later, and figuring out the right time to put that stuff in front of them. And time here can be sort of linear in terms of now versus later, or it can speak to the user's context in some way. Are they on their phones on the bus? Are they prepping for a meeting? Are they in a meeting? We're sitting here in a meeting, so these are kind of top of mind right now. But context is incredibly important when we talk about personalization.
Absolutely. And, this idea of delivering the right content to the right user at the right time is sort of a well understood high level goal of personalization, which is in and of itself one of the most popular topics in marketing technology and digital marketing. And what we see as an agency with boots on the ground, working with clients, actually formulating personalization strategies and implementing personalization, is that many organizations, I would even say most organizations, have some kind of challenge or struggle actually achieving success with personalization out of the gate. And so we're sort of asking the question, why is that? There are many studies, and this slide shows just one example, where surveys show that of various digital marketing strategies and initiatives across different industries, personalization continues to appear at the top in terms of areas where people have had challenges or troubles. So the question is, why is that the case? And what we found is that there are many reasons, but one theme has really come to the top for us. And that is this idea that personalization today has become a very technical conversation. So often when we begin talking about personalization, we're inclined to say, what will the personalization engine be? Which personalization software or platform will we use? How will we integrate APIs to connect customer data to drive data-driven experiences? And in this way, we by default fall into a technical conversation. And maybe part of the reason for that is that marketing technology in general is now more technical than ever. This particular image comes from Scott Brinker, chiefmartech.com, and shows over time, since in this case 2011 to 2018, the number of marketing technology vendors and solutions that have entered the marketplace in that time. And in just last year, when it was last tallied, there were over 6,800 distinct MarTech vendors and solutions in the marketplace, compared to 150 or so in 2011. So we see this as a way of reflecting the vast investment into technology that businesses are making and that vendors are offering in this way. Similarly, if you look at various studies, in this case, this one from the Gartner CMO Spend Survey, 2018-2019, which involved a poll of over 600 marketing leaders across industries in North America and the UK. They found that technology represents the single largest area of investment in marketing resources and programs. So we see that the conversation can become technical, and we see that the investment is in technology.
So if we go back to that simple equation of putting the right stuff in front of the right person at the right time, it's a pretty simple concept, right? But when we shift the conversation to strictly speak of marketing technology, we complicate that equation. So we're essentially losing, the focus of the person, the content, and the time.
So that brings us to this idea of personalization readiness, as we call it. In other words, what can you do to better understand some of the types of challenges and prerequisites associated with a successful personalization strategy, and gather that information to put together a strategy and plan so that you can be successful in rolling out personalization campaigns within your organization. So what do I need to prepare for a data-driven personalization strategy? So in the rest of the presentation, we'll walk through several points that will be helpful for you in identifying what that entails. And we call these the 5 pillars of personalization, a framework for you to think about and plan a personalization strategy. So those 5 pillars are: number 1, user; number 2, content; number 3, staffing; number 4, tech stack; Number 5, experiment. And we'll walk through each of these 5 pillars now.
So the probably the most important piece, and definitely the piece with which you should start, is understanding who your users are and what they need to change their behavior in some way. So, the first thing that you want to think about when thinking about your users is, who are your users? You can't be all things to all people, and that's fine. That's literally the definition of personalization. It's being the right thing to the right person. So figuring out what that is needs to start with, who is the right person, right? So, from folks from a social science background, this is essentially the definition of sampling. Particularly for folks coming in from marketing, thinking about things like demographic. Which demographic do you want to appeal to? Who might be the low-hanging fruit? Who might represent the greatest gain in terms of margins and all sorts of yummy profit-related types of things. And then thinking about how you're going to start reaching them. The next piece, once you figure out who it is that you want to reach, is putting yourself in that person's shoes. So something that we see quite a bit within personalization, UX, and digital platforms, and really any other platform, is something may seem like a great idea initially, but once you put it in front of a user, it falls flat on its face. So a big reason for that is that there is such a thing as groupthink, and the biggest way that you can combat that is by empathizing with your user. So not only is this understanding who your user is, but really deeply sympathizing and being able to put yourself in that user's shoes.
Kasia, one of the things I think about there is how personalization it might be framed as delivering relevant experiences and meaningful experiences for people. And so the idea would be, how can you deliver an experience that's truly relevant to someone if you don't understand what relevant means to them, right? What their wants, needs, and desires are.
That is a great point. And I think, the key thing, in addition to understanding, as an individual within an organization, is making sure that the whole team aligns on that. So in terms of, how are we going to get to empathy? The first step and most important step that may seem inefficient, particularly for folks, coming in from marketing or from technology, is talking to your users. There are a lot of users out there. How are we going to find the time to, talk to any one of them? Even if we talk to one, how is that going to scale to the millions or billions of people that we actually want to reach? But really, even talking to just a handful of folks will give you the perspective and that objective understanding and empathy that can help guide your personalization endeavors to success. When you talk to users, you're not learning only what, you're learning why. So, not just what are they doing in terms of measuring it, maybe from a statistically significant sample, but why is it that they're doing that? In what context are they doing it? That predictive piece will help you put together personalization that will allow you to predict, to actually kind of cause something into being. A lot of research is sort of hindsight 2020, and that missing piece is the ability to figure out, gee, well, what are the variables that are going to create something in the future? So to kind of wrap up that talking to your users piece, there are a variety of methods to go about doing that. Starting with fairly simple things like intercepts. These could be unstructured conversations that you have with your customers. going into much deeper things like ethnographies, where you see what your users are doing and talking to them throughout the context of not just their interactions with whatever your platforms are, but in the course of their daily lives. Those rich insights will help you understand, what is that compelling piece of content going to be that will help them convert to customers, or tell their friends, that you're the awesomest thing ever and that they should also buy your products. To help complete the picture, using more quantitative approaches, coming in from analytics and other data. These may also be surveys that you're putting out there to help convince stakeholders and to deepen the understanding and the picture of what your users are doing. Probably the most important piece is not just you as an individual and as an individual contributor understanding your user and empathizing with your user, is how do you take that back to the team? How do you create the shared understanding that, rather than having to convince everyone at every point within the project that, hey, this may not be a good idea, let's change this way. Have folks actually actively participate in research. So that may be, going out and talking to customers themselves, and this is really everyone on a particular project team should have some firsthand experience with users, so they can do research themselves, potentially with supervision, or observing sessions as they occur in real time. Something we like to do is, as we're conducting things like usability tests or interviews, having folks both on the client side and internal team listen to all sessions as they're happening in real time, as opposed to potentially listening to a recording after the fact or reading a report after the fact. Having actual kind of engaged observation during really helps create that emotional bond with the user. What we tend to like to do is, while we don't have observers moderate the session, we do leave questions open, and we do ask them as they come up from user participants.
And Kasia, one thought I'm having on that is this idea that, if an organization has previously conducted some user research, maybe 2-3 years back, that over time users change, users' needs change, people become different in that way. And so this idea that you don't just do user research once and then you're done forever, that staying in touch with the audience that you're trying to reach as their needs and goals shift over time as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that speaks to the right time part of the equation, where time and context change. We see this particularly in technology. Month to month, the landscape just completely changes, and a new product out there may totally impact the way that your users are thinking and what is going to compel them to take some sort of action. So making sure that you're staying on top of that and refreshing your body of knowledge in a timely way is super important. Creating artifacts like personas and reports is essential to kind of encapsulating that body of knowledge, but it shouldn't stop there, and your audience should, and your team members definitely should actively participate to make sure that personalization is a success. So once you understand what your users need, you need to figure out what's the stuff that you're going to put in front of them. This kind of sounds a little bit like a given. Well, of course, duh. We need to create the content that we're going to put in front of users. End of story. But another place that we see some of our clients falter a little bit is having kind of the planning and the discipline to put the right content in front of users. And there's kind of a lot of nuances to content that need to be accounted for. during personalization.
Yeah, and one of the things I think I see in projects is this idea that this word content is thought of only in one way. So, for example, an organization's view of personalization might be something simple like delivering some personalized content recommendations, thus leveraging content that's already in their content platform or CMS. But I think as personalization strategies evolve and you start to tailor messaging, imagery, and other types of content to the unique needs of a user, this idea of content strategy really comes first, because in order to deliver that experience, one would have to first produce and enter into the system all of the different types of content, categorize it in different ways so that it could be targeted to the right user at the right time.
Yep.
So content, really, really important to have the appropriate strategy.
The content strategist, thank you. Another piece to consider is not just kind of all the stuff and what it's going to be, but what it's going to sound like, right? So a big piece of content strategy is understanding that the stuff that you put in front of your user really needs to serve as a personality proxy to your organization. It's telling your user something about you. So, much like you train your employees to, talk to clients a particular way, you may have branding colors and, all sorts of stuff that goes into marketing. All of that needs to find its way into content generation, particularly when it comes to personalization, because it does create a level of sensitivity and kind of intimacy when you deliver personalized content. So as you're generating a lot of stuff, which you will with personalized content strategy, and we'll dive a little bit into that in just a couple of slides, to speak to Dave's points of, making sure that, not only are you creating the right stuff, but you're actually delivering it and maintaining it appropriately throughout personalization and beyond. You need what's called governance. This is probably, unfortunately, the least exciting part of personalization, and it sounds a little bit scary, but it's super, super important. And what governance is at its core is really just a level of discipline around creating and maintaining content. The core tenets within governance are assigning responsibilities to employees, who is going to be responsible for what, to make sure that it A gets generated, B gets generated right, and then C actually gets pulled down or maintained over time. Your content needs to have a life cycle, much like, really anything else that you create or do. There is a project life cycle to content. The stuff that was relevant 10 years ago or even a month ago may not be relevant today, and that is particularly important for personalization, where we're creating these intimate messages that may not be relevant even in 5 minutes. And the third kind of nuance here is creating taxonomies and other ways of allowing you to track your content and your users and to connect the two.
On that topic of governance, I think in some cases where an organization starts a personalization pilot program where they build some kind of proof of concept or demo with their new platform, and they put content into that looks great and works great, I think this idea of governance comes to the foreground once they roll out this capability in their organization. Now it's time to actually start creating individual personalized campaigns, and these questions of who creates the content, what format should it be made in, how long should it remain in the system, should it be automatically expired, should it stay on the site? All these questions come up that if you don't have a plan for that in advance, it can be crippling in some cases. And when we're talking about actually, if you could hop back. If we're talking about entering content into a platform, such as Drupal, for example, with a personalization scenario, the best place you can be in is if that content is enriched with structure. And in this context, I will define structure as making the content machine understandable. So a personalization platform is going to be configured in some way to target some subset of your audience and then deliver some content just to those users. And in order for the system to map content to the user, we rely on the structure of the content. So in Drupal terminology, for those of you who use Drupal platforms, taxonomy. The taxonomy features of Drupal that allow you to tag the content will essentially create ways for you then to associate those tags or terms to distinct audience segments. So very important to enrich content with structure by adding metadata and tagging.
And this is relevant not only to folks working with Drupal platforms, but really anyone generating content. You should always be considering consider a taxonomy for all of the content that you create. So whether this is controlled vocabularies about the way that you call your products or your customers, making sure that you have that is really, really important to not just personalization, but content and messaging as a whole.
Yeah, actually, if I could add one more note on this, when we think of this idea of tagging, I think for many people, the first thing that comes to my mind is tagging content to file that content by subject matter. So if it's a blog post, for instance, that's related to sports, you might tag it with a tag called sports, for instance. And in this case, when we say tagging and structure, we're referring to that, but also the idea of other classifications that are not necessarily customer facing. So for example, imagine a workflow where as you enter content into your platform, you're actually tagging it to describe the audience that it's intended for, or the stage of the buyer's journey that the content is most relevant for example. And by tagging the content in this way to describe not only what it's about, but when it is most relevant in general and who it is for in general, you're also enabling different ways of then pulling that content out of the platform to target it to the right user at the right time. Which brings us to this idea of atomic content. So when we build design systems for clients, we often leverage an approach referred to in the industry called atomic design, which is based on this idea of designing small pieces of an interface, small things like buttons, for example, assembling those into groupings of those UI patterns into what we call molecules, then grouping those pieces into larger functional pieces called organisms, etc., until we arrive at templates and fully assembled pages. And in this way, pages are not designed to be pages, but rather a collection of modular, reusable components, which can allow us to achieve a very flexible design system. And so we bring this up in the presentation today to describe a component-based design methodology that lends itself really well to personalization, in the sense that what we want to do are have experiences that are dynamic in nature. And so we can kind of show on these next set of slides here various different design patterns that are implemented in this modular way allow for an experience to be reflowed, readapted, and rearranged in various ways, so that as a marketer or someone who's involved with delivering the right experience to the right customer, you have the flexibility not only with your content, but with your design and templating to allow the page to be adapted for various needs.
So as we get to really the meat of personalization and all of the variables that we've discussed so far, to have all this happen, you need the right people. And not just the right people, but also the right skill set. So in terms of underpinning personalization are all of your wonderful staff that are going to be taking on this great opportunity, but also responsibility of generating personalized content. What we've found in our experience is having a portfolio of folks who know analytics, can do UX design, understand content strategy, can implement all of these things from a technical perspective, are content authors and understand users and can perform user research. this sounds like a tall order, and it shouldn't be one person doing all of these things, because your personalization endeavor will not be successful if it is one person. But having a team that either is dedicated to personalization, who does all of these things, or if you're bringing folks in from other parts of the organization ad hoc, to make sure that you're filling all of these needs.
Yeah, I think that this idea can be adapted to different scenarios. So, for example, we've seen some organizations who, more in a center of excellence model, have an internal team that oversees digital marketing, technology, personalization, et cetera, and then outsources select pieces of that. For example, visual design, front-end development for theming, et cetera. In your case, in your organization, you can decide if this is something to kind of bring in-house completely or to outsource to an agency. In any case, though, what's important is that you have all of the disciplines covered and represented so that the strategy is informed from those different points of view. All right, so pillar number 4, tech stack. You know, we began the presentation talking about how oftentimes with personalization, we get very technical very quickly. And yet, of course, technology is key to a personalization strategy as it represents the means through which we will reach users and deliver experiences to users. So when we say tech stack, what is a personalization tech stack? And I'll just summarize it here in this way, that if you're working with a solution that does everything that's shown on this slide, then you would be in great shape to deliver a very dynamic range of experiences and an advanced personalization strategy. So point 1, you need the ability to maintain unified customer profiles that track users from anonymous to known. And to be able to track users, if you're an organization that runs many different website properties rather than one, the ability to maintain a unified customer profile that tracks the visitor across different domains and different websites. So the more the visitors continue to interact with your brand online, that profile is being built over time, enriching it with more and more information about the user's interests and their previous browsing history, for example. And in addition to tracking things like what pages or what content they downloaded, you need to be able to do event tracking, which for those of you who work with web analytics, for example, very similar concept of tracking very specific types of interactions that occur while they're having their online experience, whether that means tracking conversion, form fills, button clicks, etc., being able to push those interactions into the unified customer profile, continuing to enrich the profile with more information. Third is the ability to connect data in user profiles to a customer data warehouse or other sources of data. And this is really key in that today we live in a world where customer data is very siloed. So you need a solution that would allow you to connect a personalization platform with other sources of customer data so that a personalization platform can have all available data to be able to respond in real time to that customer's needs. Next, you'll need the ability to segment your traffic and target, therefore, some subsets of your audience. And also, you'll need the ability to conduct experiments, and I can't stress this enough, with personalization, particularly for organizations who are just getting started with a personalization strategy. You need the ability to try targeting different subsets of your audience in different ways and to try tailoring messaging in certain ways. You may be lucky and it may result in a great click-through rate or conversion rate, but you may not. And that ability to conduct experiments and to learn as you go is really important to being successful with personalization. Incidentally, the fundamental functionality of an A/B testing platform is really, if you think about it, the same heart and soul of a personalization platform, in the sense that both involve targeting a subset of users or splitting traffic in some way, and then delivering some variation of content to just that subset of users. So experimentation, very important. 2 final points. Privacy features, really, really critical. A personalization platform should support a range of options for providing the appropriate opt-out and cookie consent requirements and that may be appropriate for the local market that you're operating in. And finally, and certainly last but not least, analytics and custom reporting capabilities. After you deploy campaigns, you need the ability to understand to what extent that increased engagement that allowed you to increase conversion and the types of insights that you can gain from doing this work. So I hope that kind of helps to put a definition around this idea of a personalization tech stack. And that brings us into the fifth and final pillar, which is experimentation. As I was just starting to elaborate, experimentation with personalization is not only about just conducting a test like an A/B test with some personalized targeted content. It's about taking an evidence-based approach to your work, leveraging not only qualitative data and quantitative data, but user interviews and any type of evidence that you can bring forth that would help you to understand the user's wants, goals, and needs so that you can deliver content that's most relevant to them.
So thinking back to a point that we made earlier, where personalization becomes a very intimate level of communication, there are levels of sensitivity around what that communication should be. What should it sound like? Is it a little bit too familiar, perhaps? Is it coming at a time that it might sound creepy? Is it completely missing the mark, or maybe saying something that is upsetting, potentially? The only way that you're going to know this is through research and evidence. So this evidence can come from one-on-one type scenarios where you're speaking with your users directly, or from more quantitative approaches where you have a many-to-one understanding of your audience. So, probably underpinning personalization, one of the most important pieces is this concept of evidence and objective thinking. We talked about, groupthink and, what may feel like a great decision as you're, whiteboarding it out or putting it together may not wind up being the best decision. So starting with evidence and user research and analytics to plan out your personalization campaign. Once you've put your campaign together, testing it with users ahead of time, so either through a soft launch, a pilot, or something completely offline, a usability test perhaps. Once you do launch a campaign, make sure that you're monitoring it and optimizing it. When things are in flight, it's not too late to change them. As we're going to contradict Yoda here, there is definitely a try. And this is where pilots become really, really important to not only understanding your users and gathering evidence about your users, but also understanding your internal capabilities and where you might need some additional assistance, or where there might be opportunities to improve. As campaigns are in flight, you should either have already put a plan together of when you will sunset them, or you may choose to monitor and evaluate as they are in flight, and figure out when do they become less relevant and when do we stop them. So there may be, within the nature of the campaign itself, there may be something that you only show on rainy Thursday mornings, and you don't show it after 11 a.m. Or it may be something that you choose to leave in flight for a while until attention starts petering out, and then you pull it.
So the question is, now what? We've walked through all of these personalization pillars and thoughts and considerations that would go into informing what would become a personalization strategy, but where do you begin from here and what comes next? And we have this conversation a lot with our clients, and what we've seen be most successful is a personalization pilot program, and specifically one that's limited in some way to one organizational area, or if you have, for example, a more simple website that you're going to roll out personalization on, limited to one section or audience segment in that way. So a bite-sized, smaller piece that you can use that will allow you to understand how the personalization strategy takes form and how your personalization platform works with your audience on your website. The idea also here is that this is a lower risk opportunity. As we said before, experimentation is very important. So you want to have the freedom to conduct an experiment and to publish that out and to learn from that experience and continue in that way. And by doing this, you'll establish a kind of working hypothesis for how a specific website, app, or other type of touch point could be improved through personalization. I can tell you that having completed a pilot program in your organization will answer so many of the questions that you might have if you're starting to think about rolling out personalization in your organization. And finally, remember, measurement here is key. At the end of the pilot program, you'll need to be able to show outcomes and results, audiences that you've reached, insights that you've gained, etc. So very, very helpful to put together a small pilot. So in conclusion, we'll summarize here the key points. Kasia?
Yeah, sure thing. So just to wrap up, and thanks to everyone for listening, just to summarize what we've said so far and to kind of keep those wheels turning on personalization. You know, one of the most important pieces is empathy is your friend. It often gets lost when talking about personalization. You need to put together good stuff to put in front of your users at the right time. Staff is incredibly essential. You know, wherever you can handle these capabilities internally, that is one option. You know, or supplementing staff to make sure that you don't overburden them with vendors. We're plugging ourselves a little bit here. Evidence-based decision-making to make sure that you're approaching these things from an objective and realistic perspective as opposed to a wishful thinking perspective. And most importantly, experiment. It's okay to fail. Fail with lower stakes. So as Dave mentioned, choose a pilot program, put something together, test it out, and iterate. Really, the key here is crawl, walk, run when it comes to personalization. Biting off too much may lead to unintended consequences. But starting small and learning from your mistakes is definitely the key to improving over time.
So what we'd like to do now is talk a little bit about a few additional resources that you can follow up on. If you're looking for more information after today's webinar, further reading, etc., you can check out the blog series on the FFW website, which outlines personalization prerequisites in more detail. And you can also check out our free book and previously recorded webinar on personalization best practices with Acquia. And speaking of Acquia, we'd love to hear now from Eric, who can tell us a little bit more about the Acquia platform. When I described the personalization tech stack a little earlier, you know, I can tell you that the Acquia offering meets every single one of those requirements. And so we'd like to turn things over to Eric right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave and Kasia. And we got some great questions, some of which I answered live in the chat. Others will kind of address in the next couple minutes. But I did want to take an overview of the tools and solutions that Acquia offers, just to kind of close this, really great strategy and thought leadership. FFW has been a great partner for us in both of those categories, as well as the ability to implement, and their Drupal expertise is obviously very high. So, what I want to talk about now is the actual technical requirements and components that can make this possible at an organization. But at a really high level, what we think of and what our goal and objective is to deliver the universal platform for the world's greatest digital experiences. And the strategy that you just heard Dave and Kasia talk about is critical to that. And we think that we can provide the technology to help do that. And one thing that I really want to make clear is we had a shift in the way that we think about our Acquia experience platform this year. And it's less about the products that we provide and the people that we're trying to solve these problems for. So the developers who build the amazing digital experiences, the operators, the ones who manage the day-to-day operations of a scalable, worldwide, world-class digital experience. And then, of course, who I imagine many of you are today, the marketers, the ones who are looking to optimize the experience that the developers have built and the operators are managing. And we've actually organized our product teams around these three groups. So we have a team, they're actually focused on the marketing hub, and they wake up thinking about marketers and they go to sleep thinking about marketers. And we think about these three things: build, operate, and optimize, really as end user outputs. And we saw, it's great to see the alignment between the way that FFW sees the world and the way that we're thinking about things: user profile management, analytics, personalization management, content authoring. These are all the types of outputs for the folks that are on the line that they're going to be able to leverage and use to show value for these tools of their own organizations. And of course, there are products here, and I don't mean to say that they're not, but we have an extensive platform, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later, but this is the Marketing Hub and Experience Factory and all the different components that can bring these types of amazing digital experiences to life. But what this really means for our customers, for you, is this promise of freedom, which means the freedom from the constraints of proprietary software. And also, I love the Scott Brinker visual, because you want to be able to use your own tools. You also want to be able to be future-proof and integrate with the tools that you'll be purchasing throughout the course of this year and beyond. So that freedom to integrate with the tools you use today and the ones that you'll use tomorrow. And that is our promise to our customers. And then, again, we see a lot of really great alignment here, because we're thinking about crawl, walk, run. And when we say fail, we say fail early, right? Fail at crawl, fail in pilot if you have to, and maybe you won't, but some will, where you can do things with lower effort and faster results. Things that you can start with today from a content and data perspective. Taking those learnings and lessons and moving into the walk phase, which is maybe going to require a little more content and data, but it's going to have a higher impact. And then run is really when you're starting to get your feet wet. You know your customers, you have a great content strategy, and you're thinking about things, those almost North Star personalizations, like I like to call them. And our personalization portfolio supports these three tools: Acquia Profile Manager to collect data, build unified user profiles, and segment visitors based on these characteristics, including taxonomy, like I was talking to some folks about on the chat. Acquia Lift is where you can actually action the segments, take the content that you've built and action all those great user profiles with personalized content to drive really great customer experiences that drive engagement, conversion, and loyalty. And then Acquia Journey, the final phase of this, when we think about an omni-channel experience, personalized on multiple different channels, connecting these disparate systems that exist within your tech stack. So I just wanted to go with a brief overview of the way that we can help support these from a technical perspective and a little bit from a strategy perspective. But I know we have a lot of great questions as well on the line, so I'm going to ask Dave and Kasia. Okay. So one of the questions here was how to scale and better operationalize kind of these insights, right? So you have a lot of data and information, and maybe I'm one person, maybe I have a team of 10, but how do you scale that? And how can you actually operationalize that to do personalization?
That is a fantastic question. I can maybe take that first. So one thought on this is this idea that more so than ever, there's more data available, right? So data might start out being something like data in aggregate from web analytics like Google Analytics. Data might be data collected, as you mentioned, Acquia Profile Manager, and collected into a profile that way. Data might be from lead generation if you're in B2B, and data going into a marketing automation platform like Marketo, Salesforce, and this list continues, demand-based, all these different technologies that in some way are collecting and organizing data about the same person. So the question becomes, should the mentality be, let's just collect as much data as possible because we'll need it someday? In my personal opinion, the best mentality is to focus on the data that you can use and that you'll need. And so going back to the question, I think one of the things that's key is having a data strategy in place for exactly this reason. So in the same way that Kasia spoke about having a content strategy for your content, you'll need a data strategy for your data. And in terms of distributing data and insights within an organization, if you don't already have something like this in place, would be a business intelligence or BI system that allows you to essentially organize data regardless of its source, put it into a format that can be consumed and understood by your business stakeholders, and then distributing it using that platform or tool, rather than, for example, giving out the Google Analytics login to everybody in your organization, and allowing people to kind of go in and find different data that they need. So I think that would be key, is just number one, having a strategy for what data you're going to collect, how you're going to store it and use it, and second of all, having a business intelligence system that allows you to manipulate that data into the right format so that it can be consumed by the right people to ultimately be used to make a business decision.
And I think a really important piece of that is understanding what you intend on deriving from the data. So as Dave mentioned, we've seen, in our experience, there's a lot of data out there, and there's almost too much data. It's a little bit overwhelming. So collecting data with purpose and deriving information from that data is really, really important. And keeping that in mind will help you structure within the context of your organization. How is it best to collect data? Do I have the staff that I need? Do I need to supplement the staff that I have with someone else, maybe a vendor, or through additional hires? How am I collecting this data? How am I turning it into information? And how am I then sharing it out and making sure that folks are actively engaging with it?
So I know we're coming up on time. There is one more question that I really did want to get to, because we've talked about this a lot. We have some folks in the chat that are asking about it. Privacy, GDPR, CCPA, we have some folks that are active in the EU. So, what I guess I want to ask is, how do you roll out personalization campaign across different regions? And they all have different regulations around privacy and cookie consent.
Yeah, it's an awesome question. We actually get this question a lot, and it comes up on most projects today. And I think one of the reasons for that is the person who asked the question mentioned GDPR, which is a European-focused regulation. But for so many organizations who are conducting business globally in nature, it ends up causing them to adopt some of the same types of privacy policies and cookie consent policies, for example. So the name of the game is ensuring that the personalization, the technology piece of personalization, which is involved in profiling and tracking the customer, is implemented in a way that sits behind a cookie consent solution. So something that's actually providing the right requirements depending on the location you're in. So for example, if you operate in the EU, that you have a cookie consent solution that loads on your website experience, understands that the customer is in the EU and therefore is subject to the GDPR regulations, and therefore provides an implementation of prior consent, ensures that they're not tracked and having cookies set on them without their consent. And the idea is that if they then provide consent, then that cookie consent solution will allow a personalization platform to continue setting cookies and profiling and tracking them. So key to a personalization strategy, to come back to the question, would be first having a cookie consent and privacy solution in place to which the personalization engine plugs into in that way. Acquia Lift, I can say from personal experience, provides a great option in that way, because it provides opt-out functionalities and integrations that allow you to configure the right types of solutions there.
I think another thing to consider is, there may be a lower tech solution to the question as well. And getting at that comes from understanding your user and their context. So, there's multiple lines of evidence to understand your user's context. One, the most important piece, is why we're here at Acquia today, is, a technical solution. But the other piece too is understanding what other pieces of information do you know about your users that they have consented to. Perhaps you've actively collected that, and perhaps you can instrument your system in a way that will deliver messaging using those types of things. So there may be other behavioral cues or just your knowledge of your user that you can act on.
Great. So I'll leave us with one thought, actually, a question that was more of a statement from someone online. He said, every company that captures data, and this is from Robert Collins, every company that captures data becomes a global company. and is impacted by GDPR, especially as that
Yeah.
across the cloud. So I think
Yeah.
really important to keep that. I think that's an interesting thing to close on. So I just wanted to say thank you to Dave and to Kasia, FFW, of course. And I really appreciate everyone on the line. There's been some questions. We will provide you with the webinar and the content afterwards. So for those of you frantically trying to click on the additional resources tab, you will get that information, we promise. And just thank you for your attendance and participation today. A lot of great questions.
Great. Thank you, Eric and Bridget. Thanks to Acquia for hosting us today. Thanks you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.